Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and most welcome to Stockholm. I'm Peter Johnson, the chairperson of the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan. Most welcome to our international conference, Afghanistan's Road to Self-Reliance. A special welcome to Her Excellency Dr. Habiba Sarabi and other participants who have traveled far, very far, to come here today and attend this, what I think will be a very interesting session. Afghanistan's ambassador to Sweden, Dr. Hamed Hami, sends his regrets and wish the conference success. He has to attend his deputy foreign minister's visit here to Stockholm. But it's an honor to be in the position as a chairperson of the committee, addressing all of you. You are our distinguished guests, and you are the knowledgeable delegates, experts, covering many, many aspects and subjects that we are gathered here to discuss and master today and tomorrow. I'm also very grateful for your generosity, setting aside these 2 days in your calendars, possibly full of other things that you could have done, but now you're here. Thank you very much. Making it possible to advance our common knowledge and leverage on our different experiences. In a moment, I will introduce Ambassador Göran Bjellestedt and our moderator during these 2 days, my predecessor, Lotta Hedström. But first, just give me a couple of minutes to set the committee side, the scene from the committee side. The Swedish Committee for Afghanistan has been engaged with the people of Afghanistan in the northern and northeastern parts, the provinces, for over 35 years. We provide education, health services, rural development, support to persons with disabilities, while supporting local good governance. The context of this conference is both wide and deep, and looks at the future using lessons learned, including our own. The Agenda 2030 with Sustainable Development Goal is, if not in all 17 goals, the foundation and backdrop to our coming conversations and thoughts. I'm sure that we will touch upon the 5 first goals: no poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality in education, gender equality, and I'm sure we will do it many times during these 2 days. But as an opening, I would like to set the limelight on peace, justice, and institutions, which constitutes goal number 16. Let me cite: to promote peaceful, inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Adding to that, the Stockholm Declaration, adopted by the International Dialogue for Peace Building and State Building at the Global Ministerial Meeting in April this year, we have the subject, setting, and we have the goal framework of our coming workshops and presentations. We have high ambitions for this conference, and we hope you will help us to fulfill these. Afghanistan has been the scene of armed conflict with foreign involvement since 1979. The younger generation has seen little but conflict in their lives. During the last 15-year period, the international community has intervened with roughly $1 trillion $1 trillion in military operations. Compared to development aid, that's a ratio of 20 to 1. 20 to 1. Both figures are of the magnitude where we normally have lost all senses of size and reality. They just become figures, incommensurable abstractions. But now we are in the favorable situation that the ISAF, International Security Assistance Force countries, are evaluating their respective efforts. The figures I mentioned, the ratio I gave to you, will become more concrete. Thus, our purpose for these 2 days are fourfold. We can and we will analyze the learnings accumulated during the last 15 years of operations. We can and we will, from that, draw conclusions and give recommendations. We can and we will highlight and give understanding to the options a fragile state as Afghanistan has. And last but not least, we will document the ideas, the suggestions of conflict prevention efforts in Afghanistan and disseminate them to relevant stakeholders. To us, it's important that politicians, decision makers, diplomats, military, researchers, correspondents, all specialized on Afghanistan and the region come together in person or over the net. Sorry about that. Over the net, participating in this mission. We are convinced that you can contribute to improving the international involvement in fragile state as Afghanistan is, as well as improving the present conflict situation it's burdened by. Making the conference a leap forward puts pressure on all of us, but I believe it's possible to make it if we embrace and enact candor and usefulness and work hard. Therefore, we need to undertake the practical, leave the usual comfortable phrases behind. We are here to comprehend, enact, comprehend, he's distracting me. To comprehend, to digest, most certainly look forward. Thank you for joining us, and once again, most welcome to this conference, Afghanistan's Road to Self-Reliance in Stockholm. And now, without further ado, let me give the floor to Ambassador at Large for Peace Building and State Building at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Göran Bjellestedt. He will open the conference. Please, Göran, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Chairperson, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is, of course, a true honor to be here today to open this conference, important conference, a timely conference, on behalf of the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And I would like to thank the Swedish Afghan Committee and the chairman for the invitation. Because Afghanistan and Sweden, we enjoy a very special, long-lasting, in many ways unique relationship. It is not an exaggeration to say that our support to Afghanistan stands out among the international commitments we have made, and it has been like that for many years now. Do you hear me? It also involves a broad and multi-sectoral engagement. It's diplomatic relations, of course, military support, international development cooperation. These engagements are well known, and they will be further developed during the days ahead, among them from my colleague from the ministry. But it also involves a close cooperation on peace and state building and conflict prevention. Because Afghanistan is a founding member of the G7+ group of fragile states, and also a founding member of the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building mentioned by the chairman here. And since 2 years now, Sweden is co-chairing the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building together with G7+. G7+ today is represented by Sierra Leone. So we have a close relationship with each other in this field also. And Afghanistan is a very appreciated and active partner in this high-level forum, where the New Deal principles for building peace and preventing conflict is on top of the agenda. These are principles that are also promoted to be used in implementing the important Agenda 2030, also mentioned by the chairman here, and especially in fragile and conflict-affected countries like Afghanistan. The 2030 Agenda aims at leaving no one behind. The fragile and conflict-affected countries were the ones left behind by the Millennium Goals 15 years ago, as you may remember. The 2030 Agenda will hopefully change that through the substantial Sustainable Development Goals, especially number 16, that aims at the peaceful, inclusive, and just societies. The Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework from 2012 was to a large extent inspired by the New Deal. And the new framework, the Self-Reliance through Mutual Accountability Framework, contains several of the main New Deal principles, such as the clear country ownership, transparency, and a request for accountability that is expected both from the government and its development partners. In line with the New Deal, it also focuses strongly on governance, economic development, rule of law, and security. The situation in Afghanistan shows us that the interlinkages between security and development today are as clear as ever, but also the relationship between financial support and political commitments. For us as donors and development partners, it means that the development aid must be designed in a way that it supports the political process. The political side must work hand in glove with the development side. The present Swedish development cooperation strategy with Afghanistan aims at backing up Afghanistan's efforts on building peace and preventing conflict. It has 4 main focus areas. It is about state building, it is about democracy and human rights, it is about education and inclusive economic development. And of course, it is in full alignment with Afghanistan's own plans as expressed in the Afghanistan National Peace and Development Framework. Country ownership in this context is very, very important. And the financial commitment we have is long-term, the longest actually that we have committed to. It covers 2015 to 2024, the transformation decade. Afghanistan has made considerable political, economic, and developmental progress over the last 10-15 years or so. It is indeed encouraging to see the efforts made by the Afghan National Unity Government to achieve sustainable peace. Nonetheless, challenges remain. Increased number of attacks on civilians, increased number of internally displaced persons, the absence of effective, legitimate and well-resourced justice institutions, the growing number of returnees and limitations in humanitarian access are just a few examples. Unfortunately, Afghanistan is not alone. We live in times of great uncertainty and unrest. The tragedy in Syria is mirrored in countries like Iraq, South Sudan and Yemen. Extremism and violence remains a threat to regional stability in the Sahel, on the Horn of Africa and in the Middle East. Currently, 130 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. This year, 2016, may remain one of the bloodiest years since the end of the Cold War. It is against this backdrop that Sweden now enters into the Security Council in less than a month. And we do so with a clear focus on prevention, peace building and inclusivity. An important part of our broader peace-building agenda will be to strengthen our mediation capabilities before, during, and after conflicts. And pending in the parliamentary approval, we plan to establish a dialogue and peace process support function at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Stockholm. And this will be strengthened also in a number of embassies in conflict-affected and fragile states. I would also like to mention in this context the Women's Dialogue and Mediation Program that was initiated by our Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, directly linked to our government's feminist foreign policy and to the National Action Plan on implementing the UN Security Council 1325 on women, peace and security. And one of its most important tasks will be to support a legitimate and sustainable Afghan peace process by both working with the High Peace Council and by empowering women peace activists to engage in conflict prevention and conflict resolution at provincial level in Afghanistan. So to conclude, we all know that a long-term perspective and commitment remains necessary. We also know that lasting peace is achieved through political solutions and not through military and technical engagements alone. We also know that peace has to come from below. And we have learned that to make a difference in Afghanistan, financial contributions need to support the Afghan-led and Afghan-owned political solutions. As we move steadily towards Afghanistan's full potential, let us build on the inclusive engagement of women, youth, and civil society. Because, as we all well know also, without including women, youth, and civil society in the peace process, there will be no lasting peace. And without peace, there will be no development. Let me close by again thank the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan for having invited me. And for those who have traveled from far away, welcome to Stockholm. I'm afraid we cannot offer the best of weathers today, but I hope you enjoy our capital anyway and that you find this conference inspiring. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now it's time to start working. Yes, it is. And to lead us during the different session is Mrs. Lotta Hedström, my predecessor and chairperson and former member of the Swedish Parliament. But actually less known is that she's a teacher, and she's also a trained certified physical trainer. And the latter can come very handy when you need the energy during the sessions. So she is, of course, the timekeeper, and I hope that you will lead us through and guide us and inspire us to great deed, Lotta.
Where did you dig up all those old stuff?
You know, internet.
Internet. Okay, so happy to see you all.
Yes.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mr. Bjellerstedt, for opening the conference. And happy to see so many people here at place. And I want to stress just initially how high expectations we have on this conference. We are not only having a very, very experienced and knowledgeable panelists and keynote speakers, but also all you participants will contribute, because we have a task to do. We want really to extract the lessons learned today. This is not just a show-off conference. Am I right, Peter? Right. So you mentioned timekeeping, and I think it's appropriate to start saying an apology already now, because we are very strict on time. And my least pleasant task is to make that happen. So to my aid, there will be timekeepers, and they already distracted Peter by showing a red sign when 1 minute is left. And before that, if it tends to go too far, there is a yellow sign saying, oh, now you have 3 minutes left. So that task is upon us all to keep the time, because time is precious, and many of us have to do other things as well. Before starting out with the proper program, I'd like to say that for achieving this goal of extracting intelligent conclusions, I'm not the only one. I also have to my side our main rapporteur, Mr. Bengt Christiansson, and I think it's good for you to be sure of who he is already by now. He's the deputy chair of Afghanistan, the Afghanistan Committee, and he also has a long experience of not only Afghanistan. You have been working in the Middle East, you have been your medical doctor, and of course active in Sweden and Queen Silvia's Children's Hospital, but also in the United Arab Emirates, and you're also professor in Gothenburg. So in case of medical care, tend to him, not to me. And also regarding the conclusions and the golden eggs that we will find, Bengt will be very instrumental during these 2 days. There are also, unfortunately, a few changes in the program. One of the saddest, you hear my voice is not very nice, but our beloved Secretary General Anna-Karin Johansson, she's even worse. So Bengt also had to replace her during the panel today. So you have double tasks, yes. But he's very qualified for that. Some practicalities for those of you who are used to work while sitting on a conference, mean checking up things on internet or sending urgent emails to your friends because they have to do that or see to that, as you understand from what's going on here, of course, not Facebook, anything has to be relevant. Here you have the password for Lustigkulla-konferens if you want to go out on the internet. Maybe that will be wiped out, so if you have that need, please note that on your paper. Someone might be needed to use the whiteboard for other reasons. We have fire escape doors at the back of the room in case of evacuation. And toilets you've seen outside. And the cloakroom, please note, it's unsupervised, so don't leave any valuables outdoors, but do keep them in here. And you cannot keep them here if you are here tomorrow as well. So bring your things back at home. That's an important thing. Smoking is another trait of the Swedish Puritanism. We don't smoke indoors. We keep times and we don't smoke. So please, all smoking outdoors. Further on, the lunch today will be vegetarian, so everyone should be satisfied. 12 o'clock. And you hear, if you see, I have double microphones, and you see it looks like an international press conference, which it should be. That's because we have dual systems for everything that is said. That's because the documentation of today and tomorrow is very important, so everything will be streamed. So the ladies down here, they are streaming everything. So one of the microphones here go directly to their system, and one of my microphones do as well. So that's important to know if you think that it looks too much. And for you who are presenting, please beware of speaking to all the microphones. Further on, what more important things to say? I have already mentioned the timekeeping system. I have introduced my co-rapporteur, or my fellow in this, Bengt Christiansson. I think it's time to go ahead. What time is it now? Claes? Are we on time?
Yes, we are.
Oh, we are on time. Happy. So, our first speaker is not any person. It's a very important person in the peace process. We are very proud to welcome Dr. Habiba Sarabi. She's Vice Chair of the Afghanistan High Peace Council. She's a hematologist, politician, and a reformer of the post-Taliban reconstruction of Afghanistan. In 2005, she was appointed as governor of the Bamyan province. And it's all well known, at least to the Swedish people, because at that time when the statues were crushed, the Swedish people started to understand what's happening in Afghanistan. That was the bell. And she was the first woman ever to be a governor in any province in the country. Previously, Dr. Sarabi was also Minister of Women Affairs and Minister of Culture and Education. And farther back, she taught girls in refugee camps in Pakistan. And now, most recently, in October this year, she was awarded the N Prize, Peace Prize, the N Peace Prize for her unrelenting work to bring peace to Afghanistan while ensuring attention on gender equality, on women and empowerment. And she is currently part of the International Women Mediator Network for Peace, supported inter alia by Folke Bernadotte. Please, Dr. Sarabi, welcome.
All the microphones. So. I hope that I can stand for longer time because I have some knee problem. But anyway. Yes, you can use this. Mr. Peter Johnson, the chair for the Swedish Committee, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, salam, or salam alaikum. I am indeed very pleased to be here in this very distinguished gathering. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Let me take this opportunity to thank the Swedish Committee for their long and continued support to the people of Afghanistan. Today, I am talking about peace, but also about women in Afghanistan. I will not only talk about our challenges, but also what Afghan government has to offer to facilitate international support in this area. I will be talking about our achievement and our way forward. Afghan women suffered more than anyone else in the past 17 years, and it is therefore necessary that they are now entitled to basic human rights in equal opportunity in political, economic, social, and decision-making. The last decade's achievements were measurable, but these achievements have been fragile due to political, social, security, and economic changes. Since the establishment of the elected democratic government, women have been appointed and elected to as a minister, governor, mayor, and parliamentarian. Our progress in the military and police have been modest. As I am talking to you, we have 4 female ministers, 9 female deputy ministers, 4 female ambassadors, with 1 more to be appointed soon, and 1 female governor, 69 MPs out of 249, 22 senators, and 296 provincial council members, 142 female prosecutors, 241 female judges, 1 deputy and 2 female advisor to High Peace Council out of 17 in executive committee or executive board. National policy and international community under CEDAW, UNSCR 1325, and International Human Rights Resolution are the tools that guarantees role of women in decision-making and leading issue and support advocacy for their participation in society. Afghanistan and the 49th country in the world that finalized the UNSCR or C 1325 National Action Plan draft. The first NAP 1325 implementation was launched in June 30, 2015 by the Afghan president. This action plan continues to serve as a benchmark for the government and the civil society in further rule of women. Bringing peace and stability in one of the nation's priority, and therefore women's role and peace talk and their advocacy for the meaningful participation of decision-making initiated have been emphasized on 2010 at National Tradition Consultative Jirga. This was actualized the establishment of High Peace Council. Afghanistan has been remarkable advanced in girls' education. Currently, 39% of the almost 10 million students in school are girls, whereas in 2002, there were only 900,000 students, nearly all of them they were boys. Also, the number of women teachers in school has been increased to 34%. Thanks again to our development partner, especially the Swedish Committee, for their support. However, indicators still remain worse for women and girls compared to men. 17% of women are illiterate, compared to nearly half of men. Action needs to be forced to empower women and girls so that they can both contribute to their well-being and economic development. Despite the above gain, our path to tackle existing challenges still remain longer. Advancement of women are still restrained by culture barrier, lack of education and awareness, weak enforcement of the rule of law, and above all, insecurity. The National Unity Government has emphasized on women's participation in rule and peace in peace talk. Women are appointed in key positions, including female deputy and advisor to High Peace Council. Women's participation and views during the consultation have been remarkable. However, work needs to be done for more extensive participation in different platforms as a quadrilateral peace talk of Afghanistan, Pakistan, US, and China. International support in this area remains crucial. A research by the Oxfam shows that when women are included in peace-building process, the prospect for an end to violence increased by 24%. Peace cannot be secure when over half of the population are excluded from the table and cannot be sustained without women at its core. Women's strong role in the peace talk can be facilitated by enhancing women's capacity in peace building and conflict resolution scale. The current status of success and our achievement remain fragile, and progress cannot be reversed if more concrete steps are not taken. First, to ensure the effective implementation and coordination on Afghanistan National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security NAP, a coordination and funding mechanism must be established as soon as possible to ensure complementary of effort between the government, departments, donor, and civil society. Second, women must make up at least 30% of the leadership position in Afghanistan political process. Further commitment and action is required in this area, complemented by our international partner support. Third, Effective measures need to be taken concerning violence against women. Reporting system related to incident of violence need to be granted, and perpetrators should be punished. Fourth, involvement of women at all levels of the decision-making in both formal and informal peace talks, including meaningful participation of women in the high-level political negotiation with the Taliban, and upholding their constitutional rights should not be negotiable. Fifth, a 30% minimum threshold should be established for women membership all Afghan government peacemaking bodies, including High Peace Council, Provincial Peace Council. Six, as the member country of the UN have adopted the Sustainable Development Goal, we need to educate more girls and end early and forced marriage in order to achieve Afghan SDGs. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as a conclusion, Afghanistan development agenda cannot be fully realized if path to a sustainable and just peace is not created. Women's active and meaningful participation in the political and social peacemaking will ensure success of this journey. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Habiba. Please be seated for a while, because we will open up for a few questions.
Okay.
So please sit here. I'll help you with the microphones. Let me just start with one question. You mentioned a number of positions in Afghanistan where women now are taking place more and more. How many ministers were there? I didn't get that. How many female? Four female
ministers,
yeah,
and 9 deputy ministers. I think in the history of Afghanistan, it is the first time that we have 9 female ministers. It was because of the advocacy from civil society and governmental department, or women they are working on government.
Did you hear her answer? She was out of the microphones.
Okay. Maybe I can.
Yeah, maybe.
No, I'll stay here.
Oh, yeah, we can lose microphones. We have a special walk around microphones. One is enough.
At the moment, we have 4 ministers at the cabinet level, and also 9 female deputy ministers. And it is for the first time in the history of Afghanistan, we have 9 female ministers. So it was a long advocacy by civil society and women who are at the government at the moment.
I'm asking because this used to be one of the quick indicators of female presence in decisive positions. So it's important for us to know. Please take the opportunity. You have Dr. Habiba here now, all the way from the High Council, Peace Council in Afghanistan. Please give her some interesting questions. We have time for that. Don't hesitate. And we have microphones to be distributed around in the hall. Don't be shy. Surely you have things to ask her.
Okay, so
you know everything already?
What about this?
Great. You made a perfect speech. There are no question marks left.
I think there are some.
Here we have one question. Tuva?
Hello, my name is Paul.
You will have microphones.
Hello, my name is Paul van den Berg. I work with Cordate in the Netherlands. I'm interested in the state of affairs of the National Action Plan, which I think is quite a unique document in Afghanistan, the National Action Plan 1325. Can you elaborate a little bit on the implementation of that and the stumble blocks, and especially the political commitment to this very important UN resolution? So what is the status of that now, after 1 year approximately of implementation?
Okay. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the Human Rights Department take the lead for the implementation, coordination for implementation of the NAP 1325, and relevant ministries are on the loop. And so the only problem was the fund mechanism, but there should be much coordination for the fund mechanism. But I think on the 30th of last month, November, there was a meeting by the European Union representative in the EU compound with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs together to work more about this funding mechanism for the implementation of 1325.
Are you satisfied with the answer?
More or less. Maybe a follow-up question. But what about the political commitment? I understand that especially, the president and his wife are very committed to make this work. But how is it done? Is civil society involved? Because on paper this is a very important document, but is it basically done in the right manner according to you?
The political will is there. I mean, both leader of Afghanistan and the wife of president, or the first lady, they are committed for the implementation of NAP 1325. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially Deputy Minister Hikmat Karzai, she was presented a presentation yesterday to with the program with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and FBA together. So it was all the presentation that he delivered was it was about the implementation of NAP 1325. The commitment is there, and this is the result of that commitment that they have appointed one female as a deputy for High Peace Council on the decision-making level, and two advisors for the executive board. Wanted to include women on the peace process and peace talk. And recently for the peace talk with Hizb Islami or Hague, that I was a part of the delegation or the committee for dialogue. So this is the willingness of the political leaders.
Thank you. I believe there was a question over there.
Marianne Aubry from the NATO office in Kabul. You touched upon it briefly. Can you tell us more about women participation in the peace process, especially with Hizb Islami, and if you were satisfied with the level of participation?
During the peace negotiation, we were satisfied with that because with every level of negotiation, of course, one was the political negotiation that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the National Security Council and the NDS, they started the negotiation. It was 2 years ago. And after that, with it handover to the High Peace Council, I was a part of that and I was satisfied with that. But the only problem is the implementation of the peace agreement. For the implementation of peace agreement, we are not very satisfied because somehow sometimes talks are going on or some decision making or made, but we are not very fully on the picture, but we are pushing to be fully on the picture of the implementation part of the peace agreement.
Barnett Rubin, please. Double microphone,
okay.
double system.
Barney Rubin, New York University. I wonder if you could comment on to what extent the agreement with Hizb Islami might serve as a model or template for a potential agreement with the Taliban, and what differences you would see between the two. Not the organizations, but between the two processes and the outcome.
I'm sure that, Robin, you know better than me the Afghanistan context, and so these people are very extremist and fundamentalist group. They don't like to sit together with women, but being at the table at the same time with these people is one of the achievements. I think it will be a model for Taliban that for the next time, if negotiation will be start with Taliban, they should agree. And we are lucky that the leader of Afghanistan, both for the unity government, the president and CEO, both of them, very clearly stated that we don't want such a peace that women could be excluded to that. So the women's rights, human rights, constitution of Afghanistan is crucial for us. We will not. It is something that it is not negotiable for the High Peace Council, for the government of Afghanistan.
You will have the microphone.
You said it's not negotiable, but I wondered if during the discussions with Hizb Islami, did Hizb Islami ever put that on the table or try to negotiate it or make any demands about it?
About
women's rights.
It was interesting for me because Hizb Islami was one of the party that they were, of course, verbally they wanted to show that they respect women's rights, and they somehow they have so many women on their party. They are very talented and educated, but we know that we remember the time that they even threw out the acid to the face of the women. So, but when I started to talk with them, they showed that they are very respectful. They believe to women's rights. So, for a story I want to share with you, the president invited all the Hizb Islami and the High Peace Council for a lunch, and around 50 men were on that lunch, and I was the only woman among all 50, and more than 50 men, all the different shape or different style. But some of them, they were a little bit educated, and not a little bit, very educated, because they have been lived in the Western country like Germany and Europe. So I started to talk with them, and that why you don't have any single women here if you are talking about women's rights. And so it was some sort of discussion I started with them, friendly, to talk with them that how they can bring women on the table. So they promised that next time they will bring women.
That's good to hear. We have time for one last question. I think Mr. Almqvist, you wanted to say something? In the meantime, I can tell you, I for many years carried around a picture from the Bonn conference where a lot of Western countries were supposed to talk about development in Afghanistan, especially for women, and the picture of all the participants were only men.
Oh, yeah.
In one corner you saw a white head, and that was Hillary Clinton at that time. So the Western men were there, where were the other women?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Mr.
All
Almqvist,
the
please.
politics environment is very male-dominated.
Yes, even here.
Do you think the so far successful agreement with the Hizb Islami will set an example for the Taliban, that it's possible to come to an agreement with the government, or didn't it affect their opinion on peace negotiations at all?
I think it will be a model for the Taliban as well. From one side, they can recognize, the Taliban can follow all the steps that what Afghan government is doing, especially for the implementation of the agreement is very important. The Taliban is watching that what's going on with the implementation of the agreement. So it can play a big role. From the other side, Hizb Islami promised that somehow they will start to mediate among the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Warm applause.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here.
And you will be here with us during these days, so we are happy to draw from your experiences. Now, the next of our keynote speakers is a civil society representative and a human rights defender. It's Ahmad Fahim Hakim. He was previously the deputy chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, which we all know about. And in 2009, he was commissioner with the Electoral Complaint Commission, dealing with the issues relevant to presidential and provincial council elections. He is qualified social scientist specialized in post-war recovery, with 20 years of experience working as activist and mobilizer for peacebuilding, human rights and civil society initiatives. Since 2013, he cooperated with various national and international institutions as a freelance consultant and researcher on development, national governance and peacebuilding. He was lead advisor in the civil society preparatory process for the Brussels conference in Afghanistan 2016. Please welcome Ahmad Fakim.
I'm sorry, Fahim. I'm moving just in a second.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think my throat is also infected. However, bear with me. Their Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I really find myself sandwiched. From one hand, Her Excellency Dr. Sarabi had a very precise and comprehensive speech on Afghanistan, and on the other hand, seeing prominent figures involved actively with Afghanistan. His Excellency Qaedi, my friends here, Bonnet Rubin, Anders Fang, Dr. Ben, Thomas Rotik somewhere, Elizabeth Winter. So it's quite difficult for me. But however, absolutely my pleasure and honor to be with you and to talk on behalf of those people that you don't see them, but their footwears in front of you. I would like to follow the format that Dr. Sarabi had. A brief introduction, where we are now, the impacts, opportunities, challenges, ways forward, and some concluding remarks. As you all know, Afghanistan has been in conflict for the past 4 decades. God knows how long it will continue to suffer from this current situation. But however, since the last 1.5 years, and particularly 1.5 decades, Afghanistan has been experiencing various achievements in terms of people, civil political rights, access to education and health, very promising, economic growth and development, and various promising schemes towards state building and nation building. In particular, statistics on rights of girls to education are very demanding. It says that around 4 million of 9 million students are now girls, and access to health has improved to 70 to 80%. Quite significant decrease in the number of mothers and child mortality rates, very much in line with SDG as highlighted by Dr. Sarabi. Though it has always been a challenge for Afghanistan to simultaneously focus on implementing MDG as well as SDG, since Afghanistan joined 5 years later to MDG. Despite the growing security challenges, Afghanistan since 2004 conducted 8 rounds of presidential, parliamentary, and provincial council elections. In all these elections, participation of women were very unique and promising. And it really shows active roles and interest of women in support of democratic processes in the country. As a matter of fact, all these achievements and development in a country like Afghanistan were not possible if the country was lacking political, financial, and military support of the international community. For sure, still there is a long haul for institutionalization of democratic values and principles, consolidation of democracy, and periodic inclusive elections in a war-torn country, where growing threats to civilians and terrorist attacks disrupt people's normal lives. Still, civilian casualties remain high concern in the recent years. The UN recent report on civilian casualties released in mid-2016 highlights that from 1st January 2009 to 30th June 2016, there were over 63,000 casualties, including around 23,000 dead and 40,000 injured. Huge human loss and opportunity cost. Nonetheless, Afghan people's voice for justice, ending impunity, good governance, enhanced efforts for peace and development have been frequently echoed in various researches and national consultations initiatives by national, international, civil society, and human rights institutions. Based on these efforts, the Afghan government approved a three-year action plan from 2005 to 2008 on transitional justice, being based on a national consultation conducted by Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. The action plan was suggesting various practical measures for good governance and providing justice to all. Its emphasis was, first, to acknowledge victims' suffering through memorials and erection of monuments. In this respect, the Afghan government had a very symbolic but timely approach to name 10th December, Universal Human Rights Day, as National Solidarity Day of War Victims in Afghanistan. Good achievement. Second, to have a vetting mechanism for government officials' appointment. In this respect, based on Afghanistan Compact and London Conference, a senior advisory panel to the president was in place to screen those people appointed as governors, deputy ministers, and high ranks to be out of any charges for human rights violations and involvement of war crimes. Third, to have truth-seeking and comprehensive documentation process. In this respect, various international, national human rights institutions had researches and reports in this respect. Of course, the UN report in this respect was very significant. Fourth, to consider non-judiciary initiatives such as compensation, public apologies, and reparation. And the last, the fifth one, to consider criminal justice for perpetrators. Long way to have justice for all, but mechanisms are there how to utilize these available tools and instruments. The Afghan government, with support of international community, initiated the National Solidarity Program to empower local communities and to improve local governance through effective reach out to rural and remote areas. This has always been a challenge in Afghanistan, and it still is, how to reach out to remote and marginalized people. Meanwhile, to enhance development projects and programs, various donor countries extended their development aid through provincial reconstruction teams, or PRTs, in the provinces they were operating. Initially, PRTs were mandated to empower and support local government to effectively serve their people through delivery of basic services while improving security situations. The intention was very good, but in some instances, the PRTs become the de facto local government. Generally, there have been lots of efforts and initiatives to build the capacity of the government, to enhance patterns of administrative and judicial reforms, and to speed up implementation of and rehabilitation development programs throughout the country. As a result, and based on the statistics coming from the government of Afghanistan, in particular Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development and the World Bank, over 42,000 villages are covered under this program. Over 2 million people are directly beneficiary to these programs. And the country's GDP was increased from 2.4 billion in 2001 to almost 19 billion in 2015. These are the recent statistics by World Bank. Very promising indeed. For sure, there have been many pros and cons since 2001, when the international community was engaged in the process of state building and nation building efforts in Afghanistan. Though the intention was very noble, but in the lack of a comprehensive strategy or clear policy by the international community and the very new interim administration, the efforts and investments were not bearing the fruition as expected in the initial years. Many things went wrong, and quite significant resources have been wasted, while the expectation at various levels remained high and unrealistic. I always recall a statement which says, if you know where to go, you would definitely find your way. If you don't, every road would take you somewhere. At the beginning, this was the situation. Various pledges, commitments, and ways of engagement were made in the international conferences, such as London Conference in 2010, Bonn 2011, Tokyo Conference 2014, and the recent one, Brussels 2016, by both the international community and the Afghan government to more aid effectiveness and enhance patterns of administrative reforms, measures on curbing corruption, and strengthening good governance and economic growth. Besides all these promises and commitments, the reports coming from credible international institutions, such as Legatum and Transparency International, highlights various pitfalls and shortcomings in the Afghan government performance in achieving their targets and fulfill its promises to its people. The Legatum Prosperity Index ranks Afghanistan 147th out of 148 countries under review. We Afghans always pray to have this ranking reverse, then we would be the first place. But however, we are not lucky as such. Transparency International, in its report for 2015, ranked Afghanistan 166 amongst 168 countries reviewed, ahead of Yemen and North Korea. Similarly, the United Nations Development Programme Development Index shows Afghanistan's position 171st amongst 188 countries in 2015, where 42% of Afghan population live under poverty line, and 30% of the population, almost around 7.6 million, is under direct threat of food insecurity. They cannot afford to buy basic food basket to provide them with 2,100 calories for their daily survival. And shockingly, women-headed families are 50% more vulnerable to such poor families facing food insecurity and absolute poverty. Despite these less promising statistics, since 2001, after the engagement of the international community in Afghanistan, there have been, however, significant impacts and achievements in various aspects of life in Afghanistan. Now, Afghan national security forces are able to independently carry out combat missions, while NATO, under its Resolute Support Mission, continue to train, advise, and support ANC, Afghan national security forces. Free media and freedom of expression are promisingly promoted. Based on statistics coming from BBC and Reporters Without Borders, there are over 120 radio FM stations throughout the country and over 70 TV outlets and channels operating at the local and national levels. To give you an example, in 2006, there were only 6 national TV broadcast stations. Women's active roles in the legislation and their presence in the parliament, I don't want to repeat the statistics that Her Excellency mentioned, are very promising. The new electoral law insists on at least 25% of women's representation at provincial councils elections. Interconnectedness of Afghanistan through mobile communication facilities. It's really fascinating. Based on the findings of a survey conducted by Afghan women's access to mobile technology, now there are around 20 million mobile phone subscribers in Afghanistan. The entire population of Afghanistan is estimated to be 30 million or 30 million plus. So almost 88% of the country is covered by this, and Afghans have access to communication. Promisingly, according to this very survey, 80% of women, either through their own mobiles or their families' mobile sets, have access to phones. Similarly, number of internet users increased from 300,000 in 2006 to over 4 million in 2016. Great impact indeed. Thanks to international community for their generous support. Now human rights and women's rights are not taboos in Afghanistan. Cases of rape, war crimes, honor killing are being frequently discussed among the Afghans at different levels and broadcast by national media. Active roles of women's rights and human rights defenders and civil society advocates could not be ignored in achieving these promising successes. There is now a law on elimination of violence against women and a national action plan based on United Nations Resolution 1325 as highlighted by Her Excellency Dr. Sarabi. Though not very promising, but peaceful transfer of power is another impact in Afghanistan, where we were always witnessing a struggle of power. So there is no room for coup d'etats anymore. And we hope that Afghan people are able to cast their votes based on the constitution every 5 years for the presidential election, parliamentary election, every 4 years for provincial councils, and every 3 years for district council elections. Indeed, there are lots of opportunities. I would like to highlight some of these opportunities. Sustained international support and funding through the transformation decade for Afghanistan from 2015 to 2024, as highlighted in the Brussels Conference on Afghanistan, from one hand, and the Afghan government's commitment to implement the Afghanistan National Peace and Development Framework, while emphasizing on main 5 priorities: Citizens Charter, women's economic empowerment, urban development, comprehensive agriculture, and national infrastructure. The Afghan government's commitment to MDGs as well as SDGs would widen level of cooperation and assistance by United Nations, in particular in efforts to eliminate poverty and hunger, and enhance its capacity for service delivery and electoral and administrative reforms and fighting corruption. Another opportunity is, which could be on the top, people's reluctance towards continuation of violence and conflict gives the Afghan government and international community synergy to further boost their efforts for peace and reconciliation. Of course, in the last 1.5 decades in engagement, there are good lessons learned for both the Afghan government and the international community to build on that for their future engagement. But we cannot rely only on opportunities. There are many challenges, immense challenges. The Afghanistan current situation clearly shows that both the Afghan National Security Forces and its international allies have failed to provide a satisfactory level of security, and in particular human security, to all citizens. Kunduz is a live example. 2 times came under control of Taliban in the last 1 year. Growing insecurity and unemployment are people's main concerns, frequently highlighted in various researches and consultations conducted by national and international organizations. Okay, I will speed up. Absence of reliable statistics on basic democratic and absence of reliable statistics and basic demographic and population of the country is one of the key challenges to measure further success and achievements in the country on development fronts from one hand and the aid effectiveness on the other hand. This is a big challenge. No reliable statistics on refugees, displacement, internally displaced people, and generally on the population of Afghanistan. I would like to highlight that overemphasis on the notion of Afghan-led and Afghan-owned processes for peace and reconciliation would systematically overshadow the United Nations mediatory role from one hand and the meddling of peace spoilers in the region. Growing religious extremism and radicalization of young generation requires the Afghan government and its international allies to enhance its effort for quality education throughout the country. Of course, continuation of political rifts and tension at the strategic apex of the national unity government, if continues, would be very disappointing for Afghan people and international community. We hope to have it soon addressed. Ways forward. The Afghan government has taken various promising steps towards consolidation of regional partnership and enhancement of economic cooperation with the neighboring and regional countries. For example, the Chabahar, the Silk Road, China-Afghanistan connectivity, and the Turkmenistan and Afghanistan transit train route are live examples and vital for Afghanistan economic development and growth. Just before the Brussels conference on Afghanistan, a peace deal was signed with Hizb Islami, demonstrating government's commitment and will to political negotiation ending ongoing conflict. However, lessons learned from Colombia's peace deal with FARC fighters, not to bypass victims' rights and justice, and involvement of civil society institutions and victims' family, in particular Afghan women, as well as active engagement of the United Nations would further enrich such initiatives. Sustained and long-term international support and funding through the transformation decade would enable Afghans to turn their war-hit country to a peaceful, developed, and prosperous country. Just to conclude, 10 minutes. I would like to quote former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. To conclude, there is no meaningful exit strategy, in the bracket, in Afghanistan, as once emphasized by former Secretary of State, Mr. Henry Kissinger. Again in the bracket, except joining hands on victory over insurgency. There is no any other exit strategy. Otherwise, the existing opportunities in the country would turn to threats and challenges to regional and global stability and peace. This would only be possible to chalk out a common and unified strategy and engaging policies for a country like Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Please be with us still. Thank you so much. Lots of opportunities, good lessons learned, and immense challenges. That's the core of your speech, I think. And we have a good time for questions. Please take the opportunity now to talk to Mr. Fakim, please. Microphones over there. Please introduce yourself as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Thomas Rüttich, Afghanistan Analyst Network. Thanks very much, Fahim, for your presentation. I have many questions, so I try to reduce it to 2.5. On the transitional justice, I mean, the transitional justice action plan is over since 2008. So what's the institutional framework now, and how hopeful are you that it is really beyond all rhetorics a focus for Afghan government, but also for the international community. And on this action plan, where's the memorial for the war victims? It's very easy to have a Human Rights Day declared War Victims Day. It's nice to have a little celebration in a room, and the chances in Afghanistan are that the speech is held by someone who's on the list. You also said there's someone who is vetting people for charges on human rights. I mean, as far as I know, there are no charges on human rights, so that should be an easy job. Yeah.
Let's stop there.
Yeah, okay.
That's 3 good questions, please.
Just a week before, Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit launched a paper on how to follow up transitional justice. There are different views. Mostly in rural areas, people are preferring blanket amnesty, while in urban areas, they are preferring justice by various mechanisms and means. But in the absence of a strong and tangible political will from the government, it's absolutely impossible to get along with issues sensitive like transitional justice. But we hope that civil society's advocacy and lobbying, and as well as commitment and support from international community are enabling institutions like Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission to first launch its mapping report, which covers gross violations of human rights and war crimes in the last 23 years. It started from 1978 and continued to 2001, collapse of Taliban. Communist regime, Mujahideen time, and Taliban. In the absence of a political will, it has been impossible for such an institution to launch and release that report, since its assets, its personnel, and staff would be under direct threat. Regarding the memorials, the Commission has been the Human Rights Commission has been in close contact with the government, and in one mass grave area in Badakhshan, there is a museum to honor war victims, and still the Commission is in negotiation with the government to allocate a piece of land in Herat to erect another monument for this. Now we only have this National Solidarity Day for Afghan victims. We hope that it would be continued.
Are you content, Mr. Ruti?
Can you probably say something about the amnesty law?
So this is the answer. In a country where the parliament is passing amnesty law, it's an immense challenge to have justice in place and to provide security for war victims. One of the reasons that the Human Rights Commission was not able to launch the report, as there are no protective mechanisms for eyewitnesses. In urban areas, it might be challenging, but in rural areas, it's very easy to trace down who was witnessing what and when. If such stories, such events are highlighted in the report, then the lives of witnesses, in the absence of such legal protective measures, would be in direct danger. This was a clear example. In 2004, just a week before the presidential election, the Commission was very critical of Amir Ismail Khan in Herat. At that time, he was governor of Herat. He was not allowing any other presidential candidate to have their campaign in Herat in a smooth way. The Commission had to name and shame him in its very civil and political verification report. Just the next day, the Commission office in Herat was attacked. Fortunately, there was no human loss, but the office was burned, the office equipment were looted, and so this is the experience that human rights defenders and civil society activists are facing in such a very challenging environment.
And these risks go on. Khalid.
if I understood correctly, under the challenges, you refer to that, for example, okay. You, under the challenges, you mentioned that, for example, to stress on the Afghan-led processes may undermine the UN mediation role into the peace process. Did I understand it correctly?
Correct.
Okay. Then the question is, so you believe that the Afghan-led processes, where the ownership of Afghans, if there is no UN or foreign involvement in those processes, so you see it as a challenge. But we have a very recent example of peace negotiations with Hizb Islami that was a totally Afghan-led an Afghan-owned process, and that has resulted in reaching a peace agreement with the Hizb Islami that the previous government was not able to reach that. Even in the previous rounds, there were mediation efforts made in order to ensure that. But when it turned to be a purely Afghan-led process coming around the table, then we have seen the outcome.
Could they be successful?
Yes. What I was mentioning, it was to overemphasize on Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace initiatives would overshadow the meddling of spoilers in the region. We know that Afghanistan conflict is not an internal, purely Afghan conflict. There are many regional international actors. So it should not ignore their spoiling, meddling in this process. On the other hand, United Nations as the only credible global institutions with capacity, with credibility, with resources, should not delay in being engaged in these processes. It would further complement Afghan-owned and Afghan-led peace processes. So definitely they have quite vital but complementary and supplementary role in this process.
But the goal of having Afghan ownership is, of course, vital and must be kept.
Regarding peace deal, so-called peace deal with Hizb Islami, from civil society and human rights defenders' perspective, it's much more a political compromise rather than peace deal. Though there are some promising articles in this 24th peace agreement with Hizb Islami. For example, Article 8 emphasizes on political parties' role in the election, while the electoral law has been quite silent on this. This is really good. But regarding where is the influence of Hizb Islami to have clear indicators that after this peace agreement, there are peace and stability in such area. This was a clear lessons learned from the peace agreement in Colombia after 5 decades. They said that in those areas, for example, that where FARC has full control, there shouldn't be cocaine cultivation, there shouldn't be kidnapping, there shouldn't be illegal taxation, and those who are accused of being involved in war crimes from either sides, the government or FARC side, to be taken accountable. These are missing elements, but however, it's the very beginning, but we hope that it will be further enriched and nurtured by international actors and consultation of victims' family, as well as an active involvement of civil society institutions.
I'm sure we will land in this discussion several times before the conference is over. Only one question more, and then during the break that will follow, you will have the opportunity to discuss a lot more with our keynote speakers. Please present yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Faridun Sikandar. I'm an independent researcher on peace and security areas. mentioned that there are not very good indicators that who did a crime and what are the proofs, and the process of transitional justice might be difficult because of lack of the hard life proofs. But let me explain one proof to you of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and his Hizb Islami party attacked finest supermarket in 2011, which killed Barmaki's family, 7 members of one family, including women and children. And they claim responsibility clearly, and it's in the media. So after the peace deal of 22nd December 2016, on 28 December 2016, exactly 1 week after the peace deal, the special representative of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, in a live interview, I will quote you the conversation. The reporter said, "You claim the responsibility of an attack which killed 7 civilians." He said, "Yes." And the guy asked, "Do you regret?" He said, "No." The guy asked, "Was it a human act?" He said, "Yes, and it was necessary of that time." And the guy asked, "Do you apologize?" The special representative said, "No." And this was after the peace deal. So my question is, as a civil society, I'm also a civil society member, this is our responsibility. There might be twisted and politically charged like argument and that political deal with Hekmatyar. But as a nation, as a civil society, that we represent the people, what do you think, isn't it enough hard proof that Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is a terrorist in the minds of Afghan people? Let alone, we don't talk about the civil wars, what Gulbuddin did and what Jamiat Islami did or other did. That's a complicated history and we don't want to discuss about it. But the post 9/11 order, the guy has attacked a civilian target and that killed children, women. We have the hard live documents of that.
We got the question. Please, I think we have to keep it on a principle level more. Are you prepared to answer?
Yeah. There are available mechanisms. As I mentioned, for example, truth-seeking and documentation is the beginning of this process. People have their memories, lots of stories, but they are neither accepted by national courts nor international criminal courts. So this should be presented in an acceptable format for the authorized courts if they have the capacity. And if there are mechanisms, for example, these documentation process to be complemented by a special prosecutor's office, then a special courts. And of course, it was 2003 that Afghanistan joined ICC. After 2003, when a country joins ICC, ICC is mandatory to follow up these sort of gross violations. And it could play a very complementary and vital role if the Afghan government is willing to exhibit their political will to actively urge them to be engaged in Afghanistan to deal with these cases.
I think we have to say thank you so much at this point, and please be ready to talk to the people during the short break.
No, I'm not, please.
You're not?
Okay, but how? Okay.
Yes. So a big applause for this keynote speaker, Mr. Fakim. Thank you so much. And now you have some refreshments, short break. Please make sure to be back in 10 minutes so we can keep the time.
Otherwise, Klaus will chase you.
Yes, otherwise Klaus will. This block, we will turn our eyes to the Nordic context, our neighbors, also contributing to both development aid and military operations. So this block, we will have presentations from Norway and Denmark, and after lunch, we will see what's eventually going to happen in the Swedish presentation of lessons learned. Maybe we are, Claes, can we close the door? Are we able to start? So, yes, and silence is here. So the first introducer, our neighboring friend from Norway, is Mr. Paul Hilde. He's from the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and former head of Evaluation Committee's Secretariat. Please go ahead. You have 20 minutes and we will then maybe pose some intelligent questions to you. Please go ahead.
I'll try to give some intelligent answers. I guess I'll just start in the spirit of the presenter. Okay, I need to come closer. Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, both here and on the internet, I guess. I'd like to start also by thanking the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan for the invitation and the opportunity to present the report of the Norwegian Commission on Afghanistan here in Stockholm today. I bring greetings from the chair of the Commission, Ambassador Bjørn Godal, who would like to be here himself to present the report, but he was unfortunately unable to do so. My name is Paul Hilde, as noted, and I served as the head of the Secretariat for the Commission. And I normally joke when I talk about the work that we in the Secretariat did all the work and they got all the glory, but me standing here today, I guess, takes a bit of a sting out of that joke. The report is quite extensive. It's going to be available in English probably January, February next year. It's being translated as it is. I have one copy left if anyone wants to rush up and get it afterwards. But I'll try and be, as in what I can do today is to give you a very brief overview of the main findings in the report, and then I'll have to just invite you to actually read the report and see the deeper and more sort of detailed work that has been done. First, very briefly, a few words on the Commission. It was appointed by the Norwegian government on the 21st of November 2014 and worked from the 1st of January 2015 until June this year. The mandate was very broad, and it's more or less summed up in this one sentence, which is to evaluate and draw lessons from all parts of the Norwegian engagement in Afghanistan in the period from 2001 to 2014. The Commission itself was composed of 10 members, and the chair, Mr. Godal, used to say that there are two generalists, the general, meaning Lieutenant General Torgeir Hagen, and himself, and then 8 experts. The experts being the academics in the Commission. And I'm sure you'll recognize some of the names on this list. The Commission had 21 meetings, including travels to Brussels, Kabul, Washington, D.C., New York, and London, comprising in all about 50 days of work for the Commission and 18 months of work for us in the Secretariat. It conducted more than 330 interviews with a range of different people, many of whom are here today in the audience. And the list includes, ranges from on one side, His Excellency President Ashraf Ghani, the First Lady Rula Ghani, the CEO Abdullah Abdullah, former President Karzai, down to to the other side, being relatives of Norwegian soldiers who lost their lives, development aid workers who were in the field, and normal private soldiers that are also there, including journalists and many others as well. And the Commission had access to to extensive archival resources. Basically, the archives of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Defense were open to us. We used the National Archives, the Norwegian Intelligence Service provided us with a lot of documents. We got access to NATO documents, UN documents. Basically, more or less everything we asked for were provided to the Commission. The report itself is 213 pages long. It has 14 chapters. Divided into 4 parts, really. There is a summary in the beginning and a short introduction, and then part 1 is what we call the big history, or sort of the overall history of developments in Afghanistan, with a special reference, obviously, to Norway in the period from 2001 to 2014. Part 2 takes up 9 different themes within this framework of the big history. These are the small histories in the big history. And these themes range from the Norwegian military engagement, including a separate chapter on special forces and the intelligence services. There are 2 chapters on development aid. There's 1 chapter on the Norwegian engagement in Faryab province, which is where Norway had its PRT. There's a chapter on Norwegian peace diplomacy, etc., etc. There's also a chapter on international legal issues. And then finally, in part 3, the Commission draws its conclusions and then has a chapter on different lessons learned. Before I come to the conclusions, or the overall conclusions, I want to emphasize something that the Commission also does, which is that the Norwegian engagement was very small in the large picture in Afghanistan. While it was a lot of money for Norway, amounting to 20 billion Norwegian kroners in the course of the 13 years, about 11.5 of those for military efforts and 8.4 for the civilian engagement. This accounted for a very, very small share of the international picture, and you can see the numbers here. About 0.26%, as in 0.25% of the estimated total military engagement, and 2.3% of the total civilian development aid. And as you can see, Norway relatively was a much bigger contributor in the civilian field than it was in the military.
Maybe you should translate.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I forgot that. Sorry. It's a Norwegian engagement in the big picture. Apologies for that. Okay. So, the Commission's overall results. And I'm going to quote the first paragraph from the summary, which gives the somewhat, not even somewhat, but the rather bleak overall conclusion. Despite over 15 years of international effort, the situation in Afghanistan remains discouraging. Militant Islamist groups still have a foothold in parts of the country, and the Taliban are stronger than any time since 2001. Ongoing hostilities continue to undermine the potential for economic and social development, threaten to reverse whatever progress has been achieved, and weaken the opportunity to build a stable, functioning democratic government. In the context of this disheartening conclusion, the Commission evaluates the Norwegian effort. Overall, the Commission finds that Norway had 3 overarching objectives in its engagement. These were to support the United States and NATO, to help combat international terror, and to help build a stable and democratic Afghanistan. And these 3 objectives sort of run through the report as the sort of the red line, or the sort of the main themes that they're related to in all the chapters, or most of the chapters. In addition to looking at these objectives and measuring the engagement from these objectives, the Commission also looks at 3 areas of engagement as particularly important. And these are Faryab, as in the Norwegian PRT there, special forces and intelligence, and peace diplomacy. When it comes to the overall conclusions in relation to the objectives, the Commission finds that the objective to support the United States and NATO has largely been achieved. Norway was, as the title of the report suggests, a good ally overall. The second objective, however, to help combat international terror, has only been partially achieved. While Taliban has a national agenda, the war on terror has not only been controversial, but it has failed to rid Afghanistan of international groups such as Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State. The third objective was to help build a stable and democratic Afghan state through long-term development and peace diplomacy. This objective has not been reached. Afghanistan's formerly democratic institutions are fragile and the war continues. International Norwegian aid has produced results in certain areas such as health and education. However, Afghanistan has become one of the world's most aid-dependent countries, and the influx of aid has contributed to widespread corruption. The Commission draws a number of conclusions of why Norway and the international community failed to reach these objectives. The objectives and approaches employed by the international community were at times internally inconsistent or contradictory. Security considerations drove the agenda for state building and development aid. The international coalition strategy for combating terror and insurgency prioritized short-term security goals. The choice to include the former warlords in the new Afghan regime undermined the state-building project. International actors often became part of local power struggles they did not understand and could not influence, and thus contributed to the abuse of power and corruption. The emphasis placed on democratic elections was important for the international legitimacy of the state-building project. However, the increasing and extensive fraud that neither local nor international actors were able to prevent undermined the confidence in elections in the local population. Furthermore, the extensive international military presence generated a sense of occupation among some segments of the Afghan population, thereby strengthening the very groups that the military forces were combating. So, to the first of the three key areas. The provincial reconstruction team in Faryab was Norway's largest and most visible military contribution in Afghanistan. The province also received extensive Norwegian development assistance. The intention of the PRT model was to strengthen the Afghan central government's control in the province's development. This task proved to be difficult, if not impossible. It was very difficult for external actors to build confidence among the local population in an Afghan state that lacked legitimacy. The Norwegian presence in Faryab was insignificant in comparison to the size of the province, both territorially and in population, and there was no cohesive Norwegian strategy. The overall Norwegian effort therefore made little difference to the overall developments in the province. It should be noted, however, that there were allies who invested greater resources and in other provinces, and they were no more successful. In its PRT leadership in Faryab, Norway instituted a clear separation between civilian and military activities. This led to an at times intense debate in Norway. On the one side stood those that emphasized the importance of keeping the military out of development work they did not understand. On the other stood those that claimed that many NGOs stressed the need for humanitarian space, while they really, as development actors, were part of the same state-building project as the military. Furthermore, the civilian-military separation that Norway adhered to was not consistent with the strategy of counterinsurgency or coin operations that from 2008 guided ISAF's approach to military and civilian operations. The absence of a clear guidelines on how to bridge this gap led to misunderstandings and frustration among Norwegian civilian and military personnel on the ground. The so-called Faryab strategy the Norwegian government published in 2009 represented an attempt to clarify this, but had little practical value. The second area that the Commission focuses on is special forces and intelligence. The Norwegian Special Forces and the intelligence services developed close cooperation in Afghanistan, so close that it garnered international attention. They developed a concept where the full resources of the Norwegian intelligence service were directly available to the special forces in the field. This concept was named National Intelligence Support Team, or NIST. The joint activities of the Special Forces and Intelligence Service in Kabul from 2007 were particularly important. The Special Forces and the intelligence had a clearly defined mission that focused on safeguarding Kabul and building up the Afghan Police Crisis Response Unit 222, or CRU 222. Both these missions represented important contributions to building an Afghan state, and CRU 222, which Norway still supports, represents one of the very few lasting results of the Norwegian military engagement in Afghanistan. The third area the Commission emphasizes is peace diplomacy. Norway's engagement in the area of peace diplomacy helped put dialogue between the parties on the agenda. Norway was one of the first countries to develop contacts with the Taliban. Already by 2007, Norway began paving the way for negotiations between Afghan authorities and the Taliban, in consultation with President Hamid Karzai. Norway also worked towards influencing the internal processes in Washington until 2011, when the US first opened up for the possibility of negotiations. The Norwegian engagement may be divided into two phases or tracks. The first track stretches from 2007 to 2008 and involves contact directly with the Taliban leadership in Quetta in Pakistan. The main effort here was to establish a dialogue between the Afghan authorities and the Taliban. It took 2 years before Norway informed the United States about these contacts. The second track stretches from 2010 until 2014 and beyond the time period that the Commission looked at. Contacts here are with the Taliban's political commission in Doha, in Qatar, and was primarily directed at facilitating contacts between the US authorities and Afghan authorities on one side and the Taliban. Neither Norwegian nor other attempts to negotiate a settlement were successful. Peace diplomacy was nonetheless, the Commission finds, an important Norwegian contribution. Commission finds that the high-level dialogue between the Norwegian authorities and their Afghan and US partners likely helped to influence their view on the potential for negotiations with the Taliban. Together with others, Norway also sought to influence the Taliban's thinking as to what a political solution must and would entail. Norway established a dialogue with the Taliban at an early stage on the need for the movement to change its political views and approach, for instance concerning the women's role in society, if the movement did wish to return to a place in Afghan political life. The Norwegian engagement was, of course, more than just the three areas. And I'll say a few words now about the overall military and then the overall civil as in development aid engagement. Despite being quite small, the military involvement in Afghanistan was extensive and challenging for the Norwegian armed forces. Parts of the military Norwegian military struggled to maintain the committed level of forces, which indicates the level of high priority that Norwegian authorities gave to the participation in Afghanistan. All in all, 9,000 Norwegian men and women served with the military in Afghanistan, of which 10 lost their lives and 19 were seriously injured. The Norwegian contribution, as noted, comprised only a small part of the overall international military presence. With the partial exception of the activities in the Faryab province, Norway had no illusions that the Norwegian forces alone could change the situation or developments in Afghanistan. Okay. The Norwegian forces were part and parcel of an international effort and an international military strategy. For Norway and the armed forces, Afghanistan was the first post-World War II mission abroad that involved regular combat. This brought renewed awareness of the value of expertise, professionalism and experience in combat situations. And furthermore, it also sort of led to the development of the care for veterans in the Norwegian military. I'll have to speed up here as well. Norway also gave, as noted, extensive development aid. A primary objective of this, like it was for all the countries, was to contribute to building a democratic and, in the long run, well-functioning and economically independent Afghan state. At the end of 2014, the international Norwegian state-building effort had achieved some results compared to the situation in 2001, when much of Afghanistan lay in ruins after decades of civil war. However, compared to the most ambitious goals to achieve a peaceful democratic development, the results were nonetheless disappointing, not at least in light of the significant resources invested in the project. From an early state, Norway's goal was for the Afghan authorities to take responsibility for development and state building to the greatest extent possible. From a development point of view, these were sound policy objectives, but soon proved unrealistic to achieve. Development aid should, from the Norwegian perspective, also be needs-based and not security-driven. The Norwegian government channeled funding through the to the Afghan national budget primarily via the World Bank Multi-Donor Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund, or ARTF, and supported the Afghan authorities through various UN-led programs. Yet, roughly 35% of Norwegian civilian aid still went to non-governmental organizations, the aim of which was to spread risk and reach out to areas with weak local authorities. Norway did achieve, prioritize different fields such as education, rural development, good governance, with women's rights and gender equality being cross-cutting themes. In some of these areas, the Norwegian-funded projects achieved good and important results. The gradual worsening of the security situation made, however, monitoring and evaluation of projects in the field very difficult. And this was not just sort of something that concerned Norway, but all actors in Afghanistan. But even the Commission finds, even considering this security aspect, Norwegian performance assessments was too weak. Norwegian aid was part and parcel of the international framework of extensive aid and inadequate follow-up and control. This aid thus contributed to the growing problem of corruption. And the significant volume of Norwegian aid must be regarded in part as a reflection of Norwegian domestic politics on the one hand, and in part as an adherence to the Norwegian government's objective to be a good ally and generous donor. The center-left government that came into power in 2005 made the decision to put equal amount of money into civilian aid as in the military side. And this came as a result mainly of domestic political issues. Okay, I think I'll stop there, but I'll leave you with just some of the lessons that the Commission draws, and you can read them while you think about questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Don't leave us. Stay so far. This is the Godal report is a part of the political process. It will be processed in Parliament and government, or is it already in that pipeline?
It is, but there is no automaticity in the process areas, and normally when reports like this are presented in Norway, they're followed by what we call it a green paper, as in a government report to the Parliament. There will be no such government report to Parliament now, but on the 10th of January next year there'll be a hearing in the Parliament where the government, the Foreign Minister and Defense Minister will report on the situation in Afghanistan, but also report on this report to Parliament, and then Parliament will take that further.
But how has it been received so far? Has it caused a lot of debate in Norway?
In the press, initially it did. But it, as in the press, has a very, very short attention span. So, as you all know, so it disappeared quite quickly from the public view. But generally, as in the report has received very favorable reception in Norway, and it's considered by those, especially those who work on Afghanistan, as an important milestone in the Norwegian engagement.
And quite self-critical as well.
Oh yeah, very self-critical, as I've tried
to remind a few of you that Norway in the Scandinavian Nordic context is the only NATO member. Norway
Denmark.
is Denmark. So they have a special, this is huge debate in Sweden now, growing debate in Sweden now. So open up for questions, remarks. Thoughts, please. Wait for the microphones.
Yeah.
Wait. No, you have to be streamed because we are broadcasted simultaneously.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just have a general question, Mr. Paul. You just explained three objectives, which was support to the AOS and NATO, combat with the international terror, and also stable and democratic Afghanistan. From one side, as I'm seeing, the two objectives, support to US and NATO and combat with international terror, that is more kind of presenting to have a stable Afghanistan. From my point of view, it means that having stable and democratic Afghanistan is a goal. And now, in this situation, especially if you are thinking about Faryab or entire Afghanistan, how much you are satisfied with the efforts that the Norwegian or the international community made there in Afghanistan? Because we were going up, I mean, to have stable Afghanistan, but now we are going back down to zero. And how much, I mean, you are satisfied with the efforts that was made there? Was it useful, or should we start it back from the scratch? Or just your general views about it?
Excuse me, did you introduce yourself?
Oh, no, I am Fazul Rabi Wardak, Director of Strategic Programs of the Asia Foundation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. As I've tried to sort of show in my brief presentation, the Commission is very, very critical of both, obviously, the Norwegian, but also the general international effort, saying that large parts of it were very, as in it was very well intended, but because the different goals were contradictory at times, as in the fight against terror, or the war against terror, saw the United States-led Operation Enduring Freedom spread out in Afghanistan, and to maintain security they made deals with local warlords and local militias, which was good from a security point of view, but was not good, it quickly turned out, from a state-building point of view. So there has been a lot of contradictions and a lot of mistakes made from the international side in its engagement. So this is also why, as in some of the lessons that Norway draws from this, is that if you go in a conflict like that, you really have to think hard about where you want to go, what you want to achieve, and what means you need to use in order to get to your goal before you go in. That's really, really hard often, because often decisions like that must be taken very quickly. But still, minimum effort at least must be made to chart out a plan, and no such plan really existed, it seems, in Afghanistan, and the goals kept shifting and escalating.
You jumped into something.
We did, all of us.
More questions, please? Mr. Fakim?
Thank you. Just two minor questions. One, how Norway was dragged into this facilitation process to initiate contacts with Taliban? Who asked Norwegians? Second, you talked about Quetta track and Doha track. You didn't mention the meeting in Oslo in 2015. Thank you.
A little bit about the peace process, and Norway has a long history of activism in this field, and Colombia is another issue, as another example of where Norway has been engaged. The first publicly known big thing was obviously the Oslo channels in the Middle East. And this also plays in the Afghan case. The origins of the Norwegian engagement, which is sort of written something about here in the report, is in Pakistan and in the religious madrasas in Balochistan, basically, where Norway, 2006-07, develops contacts with religious leaders that are then in contact with the Taliban again. And the offer comes from the Taliban to Norway. Would you be willing to facilitate contacts with the Afghan government? And from there it goes and develops. And then those contacts fade out or sort of they fail to result in a meeting. There are several attempts to have a meeting. For instance, in December, I think 2008, if I remember right, there is an Afghan official delegation and a Taliban delegation in Oslo, living in the same hotel, but then at the very last moment, their Taliban delegation withdraws from the meeting. And there are a few attempts until the autumn of 2010, when Norway, after a final attempt in August to have a delegation come to Norway, abandons more or less this track and the contacts directly into Quetta, and then slowly shift towards the then German-led contacts with the political committee in Doha. Was there a second part to your question?
Thank you.
Okay, great.
You're fine.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm looking at Mrs. Ann Wilkins because I know you have read the report thoroughly and we have been taking part of some comments from that side. But I think we should jump to the next country. So thank you so far from Norway's side. Give him an applause. And I welcome Mrs. Nicole Ball from United States. And you are head of thematic analysis section at the Army Center for Intelligence.
No, that's not me.
No, I'm reading on the wrong line. You're senior fellow Center for International Policy. Sorry.
That's okay.
But you're nevertheless very welcome to give your presentation.
Thank you very, very much. And I do want to thank the Swedish Afghanistan Committee for inviting me to be here, and the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs for actually allowing me to get here. Right. I've been told that I can speak for 15 minutes, and so I'm going to go rather quickly. From the outset of the international engagement in Afghanistan in the post-2001 period, Denmark understood that its development, security, and political and diplomatic tools were all necessary to combat terrorism and support the transition from Taliban rule. As part of this effort, Denmark provided some 4.3 billion Danish kroner in development assistance to Afghanistan between 2002 and 2014. And this was to support national, regional, and global security and poverty reduction in Afghanistan. In November 2014, the political parties that support Denmark's engagement in Afghanistan commissioned 3 lessons studies. And the one I'm reporting on right now focused on Danish development cooperation from 2001 to 2014. My colleague Niels Vistesen is going to report on the second one. And the third is lessons from the international experience. And the person who wrote that actually, unfortunately, is not able to be with us today. All 3 are available in Danish, which is not a problem for those of you who are from the Nordic area. For the rest of us, you can find it on the web in English. Now, as a result of extensive consultations with Danish, Afghan, and other international actors, the team that I led identified 9 lessons from Denmark's experience with development cooperation in Afghanistan during this period. The first 3 relate to the integration of politics, development, and stability and security. The last 6 relate to how development assistance is actually delivered under the conditions that have been prevailing in Afghanistan since 2001. And then there were 5 main conclusions that emerged from these lessons, and I'm going to very quickly go through all of that. It's important to note that these are lessons that were identified. These are not necessarily lessons that were learned, and this is a very, very important distinction because we have been talking about some of these lessons for an incredibly long period of time. And the fact that I'm about to talk, and that our Norwegian colleague, I mean, it's a very similar situation, actually. So you're not going to be surprised, I'm afraid, by what I'm about to say. So hopefully, there we go. These are the first 3 lessons that relate to integrating politics, development, stability, and security. Lesson number 1 is that an integrated approach requires cleared, shared strategic objectives. And in order to deliver the most effective integrated response possible, international partners such as Denmark need to bring all relevant actors around the table to establish a shared contextual understanding of the situation and to determine how each of these actors can best contribute to an integrated effort. It's essential to understand the complete integrated effort in order to deliver development effectively. So development can't sit in its own box. Lesson 2 is that an integrated implementation of these shared strategic objectives requires that all tools are used to their best advantage. While Denmark's capacity for developing joint strategies and joint planning has improved over time, joint implementation does, in fact, remain challenging. And while there is some evidence, we found some evidence in any case, of productive collaboration between Danish and other partners' development, political, and security tools in Afghanistan, there are definitely questions that still remain about the most appropriate mix of these tools, particularly in areas where the dominant activities are warfighting and stabilization, and where international financing risks exacerbating or creating social and political divisions. And the experience suggests that the use of development tools in this context has to be carefully, very carefully assessed for potential impact on corruption, security, and political relationships. The third lesson that we identified was that a broad political consensus on engagement creates the space that's necessary for an adaptive and flexible development approach. Proactively engaging Denmark's political leadership in discussions on strategic objectives which happened over a period of time, proved to be an effective means for generating broad political consensus and protecting development assistance from political tinkering and brokering that had nothing really to do with Afghanistan. At the same time, the trade-offs necessary to develop this or achieve this consensus did have consequences for the scope of development cooperation and the development program more broadly, particularly in Helmand province, which is where Denmark's PRT they had PRT engagement in various places, but where its major PRT engagement took place. Now, turning to the 6 lessons relating to the delivery of development assistance that we identified. Lesson 4 is that developing ownership of state building is fundamentally a political process, requiring donors to have a deep understanding of the particular context and to be prepared to provide support over a long term. And if you want to, I'll email anything if you want. I can email the PowerPoint to you if you would like later, so you don't have to do that. In fragile and conflict-affected states, power is, we know, continually contested. And ownership of change processes is affected by political and economic interests of multiple stakeholders. So it's very, very complex. And this complicates, obviously, the application of the principle of ownership as foreseen in the Paris Declaration, which commits donors to respect partner countries' leadership and help strengthen both the state's capacity to deliver and civil society's capacity to demand development and human rights. And we've already been hearing about civil society's role as being very important. Lesson 5 is that providing assistance in fragile and conflict-affected states requires careful balancing between promoting the principles of aid effectiveness and ensuring adequate oversight of the use of funds. Developing ownership through a process originated by outsiders, so international community, that progressively becomes owned by domestic actors with the political will to carry forward that agenda, this has been challenging. With corruption deeply affecting the legitimacy of the state, Denmark and other donors have been reminded many times in the course of the last 15 years that promotion of country-led processes can result in both positive and negative development outcomes. Therefore, at the same time as promoting the principles of aid effectiveness, such as ownership, and demonstrating the necessary strategic patience to achieve all of this, it's important that monitoring mechanisms for both bilateral and multilateral channels be put in, that they're strong enough. I mean, they be put in place, but they have to be strong enough also to prevent the abuse of donor funds undermining state legitimacy. Lesson 6 is that when decisions are made to add substantial capacity through technical assistance, which of course happened in Afghanistan to a very large degree, it's important to actively address sustainability in order to avoid creating a parallel civil service. And donors, including Denmark, have funded tens of thousands, as I think you all know very well, of technical advisors to address profound capacity weaknesses that characterize the line ministries from 2001 onward. Donors in Denmark, but other donors also very strongly believed that improved service delivery would convince ordinary Afghans that it was in their best interest to support the government rather than the armed opposition, and that this technical assistance would enable the armed opposition, this technical assistance would enable this support to develop rapidly, and therefore they funded quite a large number of technical advisors. Now, unfortunately, in many ministries, this technical assistance became a vehicle for patronage, graft, and corruption. And for over a decade, no plans were really put in place in Afghanistan to phase out the technical assistance. And so the advisors became entrenched as a parallel civil service. And while lessons about the limitations of this kind of approach have been known internationally and globally, donors in Afghanistan were actually rather slow to demand that these advisors focus on capacity transfer rather than doing the job. So, in fact, we're not strengthening the state. Lesson 7 is that while the type and size of projects need to be tailored to context, including Danish strategic priorities, and can be expected to change over time, minimizing the number of projects and focusing on large interventions that support the delivery of results at scale can create space for deeper engagement with partners, and this includes policy and political work to improve donor understanding of the context in which they're operating. In a high-stakes context, the pressure to deliver results quickly tends to produce a large number of projects. And in Afghanistan at the time that Denmark was increasing its development engagement and its development portfolio, this compromised Denmark's ability to engage with multilateral partners and the government at a time when some very large new programs that were better able to deliver at scale were being developed. But that said, there are compelling reasons to have, at least in an initial stage, a variety of partners and cover a variety of issues. So, for example, very important issues for Denmark, human rights, gender issues, these were appropriately covered by rather smaller programs. But the current portfolio is now more condensed and focusing more on development, more on a smaller number of larger multilateral programs, obviously also partly for security reasons. So this is a lesson that Denmark, we think, has learned. Now, right. Lesson 8 is that Denmark's risk-willing approach is appropriate for the context in which there are many serious risks. And it can be best supported by strong monitoring and evaluation arrangements that are established early on. This is challenging, of course, where Danish policy gives responsibility for implementing partners to monitor the results that they're responsible for creating, and it's even more challenging when these partners can't actually get to where the activities are being undertaken. And that is there has been some adaptation in this regard, and this should be carried over in the future. Lesson 9 is that for Denmark to be an influential voice in aid coordination, staff need sufficient seniority, strong country knowledge, relevant technical expertise, and a consistent presence. And this is by no means, this is an observation, this is by no means a criticism of any Danish officials that we met, but we did observe that these factors are extremely important. Now, I'm just going to briefly show you the 5 main conclusions that we identified. And as I said, none of this is tremendously new or surprising, context matters, and it's hard to operate in a complex context, but there have to be efforts constantly learn about the context and adapt programming. The second conclusion is that because the context is complex, as I said, it's important to be flexible and adapt. The third conclusion is that it's important to do what's right, and that may sound a bit odd, but the fact of the matter is that Denmark's cooperation with Afghanistan has strongly reflected its support for internationally agreed principles governing the delivery of development assistance. It's difficult to do this in an Afghan context, but Danish officials generally agreed it's important to maintain a principled approach because it may lay the basis for more positive engagement later on. Fourth, integrated strategies, planning, and implementation are all important. So implementation sometimes gets forgotten. And the last conclusion is that when you're working in fragile and conflict-affected states where development occurs alongside a stabilizing, hopefully stabilizing military presence, although we've seen that it's not always the case, it's important to make every effort to learn from experience. And this may sound really strange in a lessons learning study, but the fact of the matter is individuals learn. We came across evidence of individuals learning. The point is that institutions have to learn, and that has to be very consciously fostered.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Give her an applause now, because we will not open up for questions right now, but rapidly go further with the second half of the Danish presentation. I especially like this one. It's important to try to do what's right, isn't it? Yes. Please, now I read on the right line and say Mr. Nils Klingenberg Ristisen. He was a former head of thematic analysis section at the Army Center for Intelligence, but right now you are a chief executive consultant for the Danish Army.
Right.
So please go ahead and tell us your story.
Thank you. I will try to do what is right.
Jane, should we change the...
Please do what's right. That's better.
While I find this, I can...
You will have the expertise.
That's all right.
There we are.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation to come here and speak and share lessons. Very much in line with what the Norwegian investigation showed and what Nicole just told you. I think this may be lessons identified and maybe not lessons learned. So I acknowledge very much the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan for trying to learn, trying to actually actively use this process and then trying to use lessons learned or turning lessons identified into lessons learned. I think that is extremely worthwhile. I just want to say to Lotte, we've been a member of NATO since 1949, one of the founding members. It's all right.
Now I have to say that.
No, it's all right.
I'm not that confused. Actually, I was about to say that outside the EU, Norway is the only
That's right.
member, and that gives them a certain position.
Yep.
I knew that. I'm sorry.
But also on behalf of the Royal Danish Defence College, thank you for the invitation. As Nicole already told you, there are 3 reports. There are some over here in Danish, but they are translated into English and they are available at the website. The site is up there, otherwise just contact us and we are very happy to provide them in English. I'm a historian, but I also have some Afghan experience, and that's going to show through this briefing. My agenda falls mainly in 2 parts explaining these Danish lessons. There are lessons from Afghanistan, and then there are lessons on collecting lessons. You can call them lessons on learning, and I thought that they were something we came about in our in our investigation, in our study, and I think they are really important to draw forward as well. What I'm going to brief you is going to cover most of the study, but obviously because of time we have to make it rather compact, so I've taken out some of the key findings and conclusions because there are lots of them. Hopefully there will be time for questions at the end, or you're always very welcome to contact us afterwards, even after the conference, to elaborate on any of these issues. First of all, I just want to show a little bit about the Danish contribution to Afghanistan, what we're talking about. And this is the military and stabilization effort that I show you up here just to set the stage. This is except some special operations forces and except some Air Force contributions with F-16s and Hercules. And please note the dispersion in Afghanistan, both in terms of geography and in terms of time where Denmark was. I'm reminded of Mr. Hakim's words that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. But what I've tried to put up there is sort of the main Danish contributions. The numbers up there in parentheses is the number of military soldiers, the plus denotes a tactical stabilization advisor. The main effort falls into the battle group in Helmand, where we had about 700 soldiers from 2006 to 2014. But even that effort was very sort of diverse. The first 2 years was spent on combat operational patrols in the desert. Then we had an area of operations around Gereshk in Nai Sharaj district for a number of years. And then for the last couple of years, we built capacity with the Afghan National Army. So it wasn't a continuous effort. And that makes it difficult to compile lessons when the effort is so dispersed. It also makes it more difficult to compare lessons, but at least you have the opportunity to compare the lessons. I also want to put some numbers on there. We've heard about trillions of dollars. Now, our part of the study is into stabilization funds and CIMIC funds. We're talking about 16 million, not billion or trillion, but 16 million Danish kroner. That's about $2.5–3 million in stabilization funds. The CIMIC funds are about 7 million Danish kroner over the entire time period. That's a little over $1 million. These are peanuts in terms of money. I always like to draw attention to it's not just about the money. 43 Danish soldiers lost their lives in this effort. And then I'm not even counting Afghan lives or Allied lives. So it's more than just the money. The task to collect experiences from Afghanistan was decided by Parliament in 2014, started in 2015. Our job in Part 3 was to collect lessons from CIMIC and stabilization projects, which were made with defense or foreign affairs funds, and to assess whether and to what extent stabilization and operations were comprehensive, that is, coordinated, how they work together. CIMIC is Civil Military Cooperation, so we are at a very tactical level down on the ground where CIMIC takes place. The study was to draw upon existing material, not create new studies. It were to be short, realistic, and applicable. For me as a historian, I went about the task. We were a small team of 3 doing this. I did a hermeneutic approach on source materials and archives, which meant we based everything on sources. We didn't have a primary thesis to go into it. Was it good or bad? We were led by the archives that we went into. Nicole already mentioned the other 2, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs collected experience on development aid, the one we just heard, and then the Danish Institute for International Studies collected the international experiences. And that's absolutely worth reading as well. It's a really good study, so I can recommend that. We opted, when we translated this into English, to call experience lessons. We think lessons is more a precise word than experience. You can have an experience and it can be good or bad, but what we're really talking about are lessons that are really important. That's why we use the word lessons rather than experience. Touching upon the source material and archives and saying how can we collect lessons from the 13, 14, 15 years we've been in Afghanistan, we basically had sort of 3 avenues. We searched through official archives from all the institutions. There were the secret material, what we call mission secret, from the mission, which was basically not available to us, and then interviews with key personnel. There are a number of archives up there, and these are mainly electronic archives today, journal systems. And from the Army units and the Ministry of Defense, we had full access to search. However, some of them were lacking or more or less inadequate. From the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we could request what we wanted, but it was severely lacking in information that were produced in missions that we couldn't support ourselves on afterwards. From the police, we could request a bit, but there were no files. From the United Kingdom, we early identified that as we had a big sort of working relationship with the United Kingdom in the Helmand Provincial Reconstruction Team, we needed access to their mission archives, and we were unable to gain access within the time limit of this study. So this is just a reminder of how difficult it is to compile and get these lessons. And maybe that is a lesson in itself for the future. I'm going to get back to that. Particularly the secret one is a key issue, and it's not because the information was secret we couldn't get access to it. It was because it was handled by specific systems that were in mission secret computers, and that was not brought back to Denmark afterwards, so it was unavailable. So as a historian, I think a lot of information was lost that way, just for practical reasons, not for any deliberate reason. Anyway, turning to some of the key findings, what we're actually talking about. And please remember we're talking about some very tactical, practical things, but that's what strategy and policy looks like on the ground. Particularly concerning CIMIC, we found that recruitment and training of CIMIC personnel was very difficult. We needed CIMIC operators who were mature adult people with communication skills, but they also needed the same basic physical skills as infantry, and those people were difficult to find. So it was difficult to recruit enough CIMIC personnel along the way. The flexibility of our CIMIC funds were good. The money that they brought along for projects, quick impact projects, for using, they had a very flexible chain of approval, which turned out to be really good, also compared to other international partners. We found that CIMIC was sometimes not sufficiently integrated into military planning. It was sometimes an afterthought to operations. That is, kinetic and military operations sort of took precedence. That was what people were interested in. And CIMIC did not always have a seat at the planning table when operations were planned. We found that cooperation with STABADs, that is stabilization advisors deployed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was good, but also often difficult. They had different rotation timings. They came from different backgrounds. They often first met each other in mission, did not have any pre-deployment training. And the CIMIC personnel often felt that they were sort of secretaries for the stabilization advisors out there. So cooperation was useful, but often also difficult. Mobility and transport was a key issue that is a hindrance for CIMIC work. Whereas some of our military units were in high-tech armored vehicles, these were not available to CIMIC as their own integrated transport. So CIMIC was not able to drive around and get around in the same way as some of the military units. And that was a key hindrance to getting out, interacting with locals, Afghans, projects, all those things. The handover and takeover for the CIMIC teams were often extremely short. When there is a handover takeover period of 1 to 2 weeks, it's often sort of reduced in time by internal air transport in Afghanistan and different other things. So there are maybe sometimes just 1 to 2 days for a handover takeover from one CIMIC officer to the next CIMIC officer. Integration with intelligence was insufficient, particularly in the beginning. I think this is a key issue. It's not necessarily intelligence in the military sense. It's also about understanding Afghan society. In terms of mapping a local society, tribes, power brokers, civil companies, construction companies, there could have been a much bigger interaction between the intelligence section with the military unit knowing these things, and then the CIMIC operators actually going out working with these people. And there was a watershed in the beginning that gradually improved and got better. Danish CIMIC was highly appreciated with our international partners, but they were still generalist. They did not have particular technical skills. So whenever they were partnered up with, for example, a United Kingdom MSST, it was useful with an addition of concrete skills. Female CIMIC operators were useful and had no issues with the male population out there. Process and contacts were more important rather than the final product and project. I've put up one quote from one CIMIC officer who said projects could not overtake security. If you had a bad security situation in an area, you couldn't do a project to sort of overtake it on the inside. When we look at some of the stabilization key findings, stabilization advisors were a useful contribution and well integrated. However, stabilization advisors were also difficult to recruit and with a much varying background. giving mixed results. Some of these were recruited from the street with different sort of backgrounds and skills, and that gave mixed results. The district stabilization teams, for example, in the district, were leaderless in a multinational environment. There were no denominated leader of a district stabilization team, so they all had to sort of work together and make it work, and that was a difficulty. Stabilization advisors also lacked the technical expertise and administrative capacity which was provided by military units. This was some of the CIMIC personnel offering and adding some of the administrative things that the STABATs needed doing. At the central provincial reconstruction team level, we found the lesson that representation must be at high enough level to influence what's going on. In the beginning, the STABATs were at too low levels, so we couldn't influence what was going on at the PRT. There were also certain key areas that should have been filled, for example, within the political department of the PRT, to gain an insight and influence into those areas that we were working with. Integration of police mentoring was too late. It was 2010, but it was useful, but however not fully integrated with the military and other civilian efforts. Some of the joint findings sort of that go across it on the comprehensive approach is the pre-deployment co-training between CIMIC and stabilization advisors gave a much improved working environment in mission. The national plans, and this is a key issue as well, Denmark had the Helmand plan, sort of a national political plan that sort of told our strategy, what was the plans, what were the goals, but these were not operational tactical plans. And I think we expected that those plans would have been provided by a British brigade headquarters, by a PRT, but they were not. Danish military units out there lacked operational plans or planning capacity to do this, at least over a time horizon which was longer than their 6-month rotation. The difference between CIMIC and stabilization funds, I told you about these two types of funds, and it was very clear what you could use them for. But in mission, the boundaries were blurred. When you were an operator on the ground in a village, it didn't matter if it was CIMIC funds or it was stabilization funds. You needed a project done. So those boundaries between those funding streams were blurred in mission. There was the ability, early on, the identification of necessary skills were conducted. There was both a study by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a study team that went out there. There were reports by the Danish military very early on that they needed what we call functional experts, construction engineers, road engineers, electricians, agricultural experts. There were a need for these. It was identified, but it wasn't acted upon. We didn't provide those, even though it was actually identified. So we have the capacity to identify it, but not to deliver. There was also a lack of continued and appropriate monitoring of projects, which likely contributed to corruption and substandard projects. And part of this was because CIMIC wasn't able to go out and monitor because of the security situation. I need also to dwell on the international approach, which clearly influenced the Danish. When you're a small nation contributing in a larger international framework, you are driven by the strategy in that framework, i.e. the shift from Taliban-centric to population-centric, the shift in strategies. You can't go beyond that. We also think that experiences were not collected or used systematically. I have just one slide left. The lessons on collecting lessons. It is political. There is an interest in this. I'm an academic and a historian. We collect this objectively, but it is political. And I think that's not always necessary because we need to learn from the lessons, even if they are not so nice. The mission secret material that wasn't saved is an issue for collecting experiences. Interviews are an absolute necessity, and we should get them done while we can. We also found that very few with experience from Afghanistan have used it afterwards, taught it somewhere relevant after their end of mission or their return from mission. I will end here, and if you have any more sort of insights or questions, we have a question period.
Yes.
And the reports are available online, so you can talk to us afterwards.
Thank you so much. And you did the right thing. Yes. And we are now drawing from your experiences and lessons. So
Absolutely.
we start here.
Absolutely.
The first question from my side, at any point, is there something where you two disagree on? Have you jumped on different conclusions and at any crucial point? Any? Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just say, there were 3 studies, and at no point were these 3 studies really integrated, and that was consciously done, and that had nothing to do with us. So our communications were actually rather limited. I would say, however, and we were looking at rather different things, but I was nodding just now as Niels was speaking, because there were issues that I certainly came across in interviews that I and my team did, that didn't get into necessarily our report, but very much supported points that Niels made. So I don't think that we... No.
Well, you don't disagree, basically.
No, we're still talking to each other.
First question, Anders Fenge, please, microphones.
I'm going to ask a few questions. I don't know if you are the right to answer them.
I know who you are. Maybe everyone doesn't.
Yeah. Well, Anders Fenge from Swedish Committee board member of the committee. First question is if there is any reasonable answer to why the main part of the Danish effort, the military part, was left out of this exercise, and so that's the first question, because it is touched upon only marginally through what you did there with the CIVMIC and stabilization and so on, but otherwise it is not touched upon at all. The second question is that I understand that this whole exercise, all the 3 reports, were a lessons learned exercise, which, if I am not completely illiterate on development stuff and these things and so that lessons learned compared to a proper evaluation. A proper evaluation, you see the original objectives, and then you see to what extent have these objectives been met or not met, etc. and so on. And I suppose these are actually the politicians who commissioned it, but have there been any discussion or among you people and so about these 2 questions?
Niels, you answer first.
First of all, thank you for those questions. On your first questions about the military effort, one of the stated reasons for not putting that into it was that the Army had conducted an after-action report on Afghanistan on the military lessons. So it is available. I'm not sure it's translated into English, however.
Is that an independent evaluation?
No, that's done by the Army itself. Yes. So that's by the Army on Army issues from the military operations. So I hope I've answered your question on that one. And my answer on the evaluation versus the lessons learned is the same. I think that getting to a lessons learned with a very specific mandate was a parliamentary decision. So the decision not to evaluate, but to call it lessons learned, is political and in Parliament.
Maybe also Nicole.
But I could also just say one thing. There was, in 2012, there was an evaluation done of Danish development assistance, and that is translated into English and available, certainly. And I'm looking at my Danish colleague, Pernille. I'm assuming there will be more evaluations on the development side as well. But yes, for the reasons that Niels said, lessons learned.
And that was also independently carried out.
Oh yeah, and my whole team was independent. It was something that was tendered, yeah, so it was completely independent.
Mr. Thomas Røttig.
A recurrent theme seems to emerge, which is the lack of knowledge, and if we add that to the question mark, will experience ever be used, that's really bodes not very well for the future, and might even be an argument for people who like to be isolationist. I have a question to Mrs. Ball. I also like that conclusion very much, to do things which are right. Could you give us a couple of key examples for that? What should have been better or right in Afghanistan?
Well, lack of knowledge. I just want to say something. I'm not sure that individuals actually lack knowledge entirely. And when the Danish government in particular began its engagement, it did draw on people with, primarily Danes, with deep knowledge of the Afghan environment. The problem is translating that up the political chain. And I think that's something that all of our systems have, which is not to say that every person who went into Afghanistan perfectly knew on the development side, but I would say that there is knowledge there. In what I meant with, do the right thing, this is adhering to, from Danish perspective, and I think we see the same thing on the Norwegian, and I would expect on the Swedish side also, that there are certain evolving principles of good donorship internationally in fragile and conflict-affected states. There are, which Denmark felt that it wanted to support. So ownership being very, very important, and how do you foster ownership? And yes, of course, they could have done better, but that was one of the things that was guiding them. State building was very important because state building has been identified as a key. Now, we can talk about state building and how you go about state building, and whether a focus on the central part of the state versus more decentralized approach might have been more useful. Again, we were a lessons study, we were not an evaluation study, but that was something that did come up as a question. So it's in that context that Denmark was attempting to do the right thing, and also emphasizing issues such as human rights, such as gender equality. I mean, I talked to somebody from USAID, for example, as part of this, who said we were so grateful that Denmark actually focused a lot on the gender issue, because this was something that was very difficult for us, and we were really happy to have it on the table in the way that Denmark and some of the other countries did. So as a small donor, Norway, Denmark, small donors, relatively speaking. However, by focusing on some critical issues can also make a difference.
Here we have a question. And also regarding state building, it's a matter of time. It can never be a quick fix. No.
Thank you. Just a very short question to both of you. If one asks you to draw causality between the peace and development, whether you conclude the peace will lead to development or development will lead to peace. Thank you.
A good one. Who want to start? Nils?
This is very low level and very tactical. And I think the lessons from CIMIC and stabilization work around the city, around the village, in the countryside, development will not lead to peace. I think that's what the quote was about, that development can't overtake security on the inside. There is no shortcut to peace and security. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. Peace may be political and not driven by projects. I think we found that Danish CIMIC as well as stabilization advisors were very project focused. That's why I mentioned it's not all about the money. They were very project focused on how many wells have we dug, how many schools have we built, on numbers, on statistics, and that couldn't lead to peace. And I think we saw areas that were invested with development did not lead to peace. Some of the reasons may be that we left them, that military strategy changed and we left them, and then insecurity or unrest returned. But I think it's relatively clear that sort of from a tactical perspective, that development in an area does not lead to peace in itself.
And your answer?
If I can just complement that, because I think that it depends at what level you're talking about, obviously. But I think there are ways of promoting development that can be done in a way that hopefully will promote peace at the same time. However, at the very top level, I think, I mean, we were talking just now, our Norwegian colleague was pointing about peace diplomacy. Why are we talking about peace diplomacy starting in 2007, for example? I mean, we can. I'm not going to go back through the whole history of this, but we can certainly think about the approach and the degree to which the approach that was followed in the immediate 2001 period. And here I'm taking off my Danish hat and putting on my researcher or independent researcher hat. We can think about how the approach followed there was neither helpful to peace nor to development, whereas if we had seen more peace diplomacy, more focus on political settlement at all levels, maybe we would have had a different outcome both in terms of peace and development. Maybe, but can't answer that.
That's an eternal question.
Well, yeah.
I think that can be substantiated at very low level as well, because you can do peace diplomacy at very low level as well, rather than building wells or projects. You can also have political engagement at very low level. Yeah. And I think that also came in very, very late. And I don't know if it's part of, it's been very discussed that sort of with the overall strategy, that it's very difficult to come in as a small nation if you want to do peace diplomacy, and then the whole machine out there runs against the Taliban or counter-terrorism or things like that. And that goes to sort of having a strategy or an operational plan that can be done before you start doing something. And we can go into the historical reasons why that came rather late in Afghanistan, but it's certainly a lesson learned to sort of have a plan and have it from the beginning, and then understand the society from the beginning.
And peace may be something more than the absence of violence.
Of course, yeah.
Because there might be tensions of various kinds. We still have time for one more good question, please.
What struck me...
Sorry. Documentation. We need the microphones.
What struck me in the presentations about Norway and Denmark was that apparently in Norway there was quite some debate about the integration of the civilian and the military spheres, whereas in Denmark there was a sort of chosen effort to integrate the two. So the comprehensive approach was there from the beginning in Helmond. Can you comment on maybe the impact of that, and maybe draw a comparison with the Norwegian experiences? Did you take that into consideration as well?
Yes, I think two considerations. I'd say maybe we were more clever than Norwegians, I don't know, but it was probably, I don't think you could, maybe it was a realization that you couldn't separate military and civilian in that sense, that was impossible on the ground, at least when you got to Helmand, where things were very much one big mess, more or less, and everything was sort of acting together. Maybe it was also because we were working with the British, and they had a very clear idea that the civilians were at the head. You know, this leader of the PRT was a civilian, so that was sort of the British approach with the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and we adhered to that, so we sort of inherited that. But sort of on the cooperation in Denmark, I think there was a quite close cooperation at high level, at department level, in the ministries in Copenhagen, between Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs on being comprehensive. I mean, comprehensive approach plans came in very early, from 2004, 2005, integrated in Danish Defence Agreement on the comprehensive approach, a lot of training about it. Where we see it lacking, sort of in the lessons, is in the field. That's when it needs to be operationalized. That's when the military units need to pre-train with stabilization advisors that weren't there, that did not have operational plans for the area. Maybe there was a planning capacity lacking to sort of do the integrated plan. So between the ministries, where you had civil servants that could work together, and the military units in the field, maybe you lacked a comprehensive approach, operational headquarters, that could actually turn it into realistic operational plans and get people to work together. We have lots of evidence that a lot of the work in mission were more based on personalities and goodwill to work together and listen to each other, rather than as a result of deliberate planning and working together. Did that answer more or less? No, yeah.
And you are not...
No, I see entirely to my Danish comment.
So, then we are keeping the time, which is the ultimate goal of this conference, keeping the time. Thank you so much, Denmark. And more questions can be posed during the lunch hour also. You can defend yourself during lunch hour. We have 1 hour lunch. It's arranged just outside, and free seating. Please talk to each other and exchange your views, and welcome back at 1 o'clock.